welcome to today's webinar, Protecting Equity and Access, Online Learning, Special Education, and Serving Students with Disabilities. I'm today's host, Susan Patrick, the President of ORT Institute, and joining me today to present is Ace Parsi and Sean Smith. With COVID-19 shifting much of the K-12 education online across the country for more than 50 million students, how do our education systems ensure that services are provided to students with disabilities and special needs? Online learning is defined as education in which instruction and content are delivered primarily via the internet. Digital learning is an instructional practice that effectively uses technology to strengthen a student's learning experience, harnessing the power of technology to enable students to learn in their own style, their own pace, anywhere, anytime. I'd like to begin today by introducing our presenters. Ace Parsi is the Director of Innovation at the National Center for Learning Disabilities, NCLD, where he works to ensure students with disabilities fully benefit from initiatives aiming to personalize learning for all students. Prior to joining NCLD, Mr. Parsi served as the Deeper Learning Project Director at the National Association of State Boards of Education, or NASB. Mr. Parsi has held a number of policy, research, and school-based positions from the Alliance for Excellent Education, the National Service Learning Partnership, Policy Analysis for California Education, and Fair Oaks Community School in Redwood City. Sean Smith is Professor of Special Education at the University of Kansas. Dr. Smith has a background in the area of special education and technology toward the integration of technology across teacher preparation programs. He has authored and presented a number of articles and papers dealing with special education technology and is currently Project Director on several U.S. Department of Education program initiatives seeking to further the integration of technology components across teacher preparation programs and into the lives of students with disabilities, as well as the development of a virtual social skill training experience for students with autism. Dr. Smith has served as an Associate Editor for the Journal of Special Education Technology and currently serves as an Associate Editor for Teaching Exceptional Children. Dr. Smith specializes in the integration of instructional and assistive technology into the lives of individuals with disabilities and their respective educational professionals, e-mentoring to enhance teacher education induction, online learning, and addressing needs of individuals with Down syndrome. I first met Sean when he launched the Center on Online Learning and Students with Disabilities. We hope this webinar will help the field and highlight the importance of research-based practices in online teaching and learning. We want to emphasize the continued need for supporting research on high-quality online learning. Thank you for joining us today. Please use the chat, which is in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, to introduce yourself, to type any comments, to ask any questions. I'll be monitoring the chat room throughout and presenting the questions for the Q&A towards the end of the webinar. Please share on social media. Please know that the presenters will be toggling the microphone on and off in the upper left-hand corner, and we encourage you to interact, ask questions, and interact with each other as well. So now let's begin. I would like to turn it over to Ace Parsi. Ace?
Hi. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, you sound great.
Good, good. Well, I don't know if I sound great, but as long as I have sound, that's a good start. I am really grateful to be a part of this conversation, to be a hype man for Sean Smith, whose work I follow for a number of years and who I loop into a variety of different things. So one thing I'm going to shut off my video for now because I have this little pauses, and it's like doing a presentation in front of a mirror. And that always freaks me out. So I'm just going to shut off my video. But I'm really grateful to be partnering with the ORT Institute. They've been a long-term partner, and in terms of the values of the organization of putting equity and inclusion at the fore. I'm really grateful for an organization who has leadership in the space that does that. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the underlying issues related to kids with disabilities, online, and what we're experiencing in COVID. My hope is to just provide some of the general framework. We've done a lot of work prior to COVID in terms of contextualizing this work, and we're now like trying to repurpose certain things and find relevance in the moment, and we're all trying to like just grapple with this and what does this actually mean. So hopefully this presentation will add more clarity than it takes away. That is the goal. I just want to start, I've started this every presentation that I've done in the last few years with this slide, and I think it's particularly relevant right now because while COVID is new, the challenges facing young people with disabilities aren't. And this country has a deep history in terms of thinking about how we work and support kids with disabilities. You know, you're all in front of your computer. If you were to Google today, Teddy Roosevelt and disabilities, Teddy Roosevelt and eugenics, you find a history in our country that would make anybody aghast. The picture on that left is Francis Galton. He's known as the father of modern American statistics. He's also the father of American eugenics. I put that in there because there was a very real time in this country's history where the very rights of an individual with a disability to exist were in question. Then we came to the World War II era where a lot of people, soldiers were coming back from the war with different physical disabilities in particular. And we started to think about disability now from a full exclusion lens to a rehabilitation lens, that we were trying to have individuals with disabilities succeed despite their disability. And only towards the later end of that century do we start thinking about full inclusion, and that's when you saw laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act come to the fore. I mention all that because those laws were a real response to a history in this country. And much as we can't talk about the modern Black Lives Matter movement without talking about Jim Crow and slavery, we can't talk about what's happening with young people with disabilities without acknowledging our past and why these civil rights laws have been so particularly critical and important in the lives of young people and individuals with disabilities in our country. Just looking at this now, my organization focuses primarily on one type of disability, students with learning and attention issues. This includes primarily learning disabilities. We work on dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. Those are writing, math, and reading, writing, and math based disabilities, and ADHD. But just to highlight this, and this is true for most other disabilities as well, we have three times as much in terms of high school dropouts. 41% of their peers in terms of college completion, twice as likely to be jobless. And more than 50% are involved in some way in the criminal justice system. This isn't post-COVID. This is just the reality in our country in terms of serving more effectively our young people with disabilities and the challenges that we face as a nation and for these young people when we don't do that effectively. So now the question becomes, how do we respond in light of those statistics, in light of those challenges that we have? And I would note the incredible progress that we've had over the last several decades in fully including our individuals with disabilities within our society, within our education system. So what does that mean now in light of what we're experiencing with COVID? And specifically, now that we've focused so much more on technology, what does this mean in terms of technology? I'll take a quick step back on that because technology is not this monolith. When it comes to young people with disabilities, it's not a monolith for any of us, but particularly for our individuals with disabilities in our education system. So I think prior to COVID, the way that the great majority of the disability community experience technology is through accommodations and assistive technologies. To be able to, if you can kind of like visualize our room, those assistive technologies provide you the key to enter that room so that the young person can learn. That's one form. The second is just learning enhancement. So things like Google Documents, video cameras, all different sorts of technology that takes, when you get into that room, enhances the walls of that, broadens it so that students have more access to engaging content and engaging experiences. And then the third one, if you're in that room, it's kind of like breaks down the walls altogether. This is more of the virtual environment. I list those three functions of technology for young people with disabilities because they will change in light of COVID, and they are all important to acknowledge and address when it comes to young people with disabilities. And when we think about that, there's obviously huge benefits that we can accrue. There's, we can identify and pinpoint student needs more accurately at times with education technology. We can help reduce the inaccessible learning environments. We can create more accessibility and help in that process flatten the learning plane and provide more students access to learning. We can improve achievement and engagement and the outcomes by more engaging content. We can track data more effectively, and we can reduce the costs by increasing efficiency. But much as that, there's also, like, to each of those areas, direct challenges that we hit. So disabilities often rely on visual cues to be able to say what that challenge is, what that student's experiencing. The relationships that an adult has with a young person should never be replaced. We should be thinking about this as, like, how do we use technology as a tool, because those relationships are fundamentally important. If the technology, in a lot of ways, I know Sean will talk about the universal design for learning, but if technology is not built in with accessibility, it can actually decrease. Technology can actually decrease accessibility. It can increase stigma because some young people don't have access to the technology or have access to it only in a certain way. It can, in a similar way, especially I think there's been challenges with virtual schools, with graduation rates and academic achievement, which, frankly, and for a lot of providers, we wouldn't tolerate those kinds of outcomes for traditional public schools, and we shouldn't tolerate that when it's happening virtually. So it's something that we need to be mindful of in terms of the quality of the experience that our young people have. Similarly with accountability, and in that process, if we're not being strategic in terms of how we utilize technology, we can actually add to the inefficiency of the process. So in light of COVID-19, a lot of these things have changed. So accessibility, if I am a student that has, for example, ADHD, I may, in my normal classroom, get preferential seating in a way that reduces my level of distractions. That's the accommodation that I get in my traditional classroom. Now, in a virtual context, those kinds of accommodations, that same student may need all sorts of different accommodations to reduce the level of distractions that are coming through their screens. So accessibility changes. We know that there's different ways that we communicate in a virtual setting. For chat functions can be really good for a student with a disability to go back and make sure that they're keeping in touch with what's happening, but it can also, if you have a reading disability, can be a huge barrier. And there's all sorts of issues across different technologies. And so we have to think about these one by one and how do they or don't they support individuals with disabilities. Similarly, like I mentioned, like those laws that we created in terms of the disabilities community work for, their advocates work for, to create those protections came from real areas of need. And it wasn't, and COVID does not eliminate, in some ways it exacerbates those kinds of needs. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, giving students rights to any sort of public accommodations, the Every Student Succeeds Act that has specific subgroup accountability systems so that we're holding ourselves accountable to the success of all learners. IDEA in terms of providing students the supports in their IEPs to receive a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. The Tech Act that provides accessibility, and the Rehab Act that provides greater, again, like civil rights protections. All these will safeguard rights that are in a different context, but they're still very necessary to make sure that as we move forward as a society, as schools, as communities, we don't leave a key segment of our population behind. So the key considerations for disabilities in light of all this is that there is certainly an interplay here in terms of the anonymity that technology often affords. Can be good, can be challenging. That technology can provide personalization, but can we also leverage it in a means that we don't take a step backwards on accountability? We have to really talk very contextually that technology is effective for which students under which circumstances. And if it's not all students under all circumstances, we need to be able to pivot and provide the level of accommodations for all students to succeed. Part of this is our educators have been just thrown into this system, and so they need training. Our adults need the support. Often they might have kids themselves running around their house. So it's like a very challenging time for our adults in the system. And at the same time, we need to help our adults deliver rigor for all learners so that all students can access the rigor in our education. That in some ways this has fast-tracked our pace of innovation, and our policy safeguards have to be interpreted in light of the current circumstances. And then lastly, this is true for I think all previously marginalized groups, whether they're disability, low income, English learners, that we can't get to those higher levels of learning until we attend to the very foundational needs that our students are presenting. It could be trauma, it could be challenges in terms of peer pressure, and all manner of social and physical safety. And we need to be able to address those areas. So our recommendations on this is make sure that that data and student outcomes are really transparent, that we make sure that we keep track of all this data. We know that so we can at least gauge who's doing well under which circumstances, and we can adjust. We cannot let this time, be it the opportunities in terms of personalization or access to technology, to be an excuse to water down an accountability system or advance a tracking system where some different students get different qualities of experiences based on things that they can't control themselves. For a lot of technology is right now new to educators, but educator training, education short of childbirth, I think will still fundamentally stay the most human of relationships that we have. And so how do we train our educators in light of this new environment to support all learners? And then accessibility has to happen both in terms of physical access to the environments, but also that pedagogical access. That if we have a certain instructional goal and we're trying to deliver it through an online context, that instructional goal should meet the needs of all learners. And that's slightly different than the platform that we're using being physically accessible to all learners. And I think, the biggest thing that we would say on this, as we said with all other reforms, is that we need to start with these learners. Too often, I think I've spent the last 4 years in the education space, and I frankly, when I was at the State Boards Association, just to become fully transparent with myself, I was part of that problem. I never raised, when I was in that supporting State Board of Education members, how do you think about kids with disabilities? And that was a challenge. It wasn't because I didn't care about that population. It was because they were in my blind spot. And so I think that our challenge right now is to not retrofit these students into systems not designed for them. We need to start with our students at the margins and think about how do we create systems and instructional approaches that meet their needs first, and then in so doing, we will meet the needs of all other learners as well. If we start with that theoretical average, we're just never going to get there. And so I'll close with sharing some of this research in terms of how we've approached this, and I know Sean will share his research as well. But a lot of different educators were coming to us right after the school closures, trying to think through how do I serve this population more effectively. And some were, in some communities, kids with disabilities were getting scapegoated for why things weren't working well. So we launched this Educating All Learners Alliance. You can find it at educatingalllearners.org, where we're curating resources specifically targeted at kids with disabilities and how do you support them in light of COVID and through technology. We really encourage people to go there. We've been so fortunate to have great partners. I shared on a recent call that it feels like an Avengers moment, that we've shown this light out into the sky, and all these equity organizations, including ORT Institute, jumped on and are helping us as a partnership to deliver the resources to be able to make sure that all kids are included. And that's kind of what I have. I'll pass it over to Sean, or I can answer any questions now, whatever works best. But thanks so much for giving me this time.
Thanks, Ace. We'll take questions at the end and turn it over to Sean. Dr. Smith.
Well, great. Hello, everybody, and I'll turn my video on for just a moment to say hello, and I'll turn it off now, and now we can center to focus on the things. It is tough to follow Ace, and so I appreciate this time, though. And my hope here is that, you know, when we think about the online learning for individuals with disabilities, so many things come into our conversation. Everything from IEPs, the administrator, wait a minute, how are we going to measure our goals and benchmarks? Wait a minute, that progress monitoring we have aligned, how are we bringing this into the online distance environment? Behavior, we're trying to get engagement to our students, so we're trying to assist the adult in the home with behavior that they're now seeing that they hadn't seen in the past. The list goes on, and yet I have 15 minutes. And so with those 15 minutes, I'm going to go a little bit 200, 300 feet in the air, talk about some general things that we've learned, particularly through, and I was introduced with the University of Kansas, but as Susan mentioned, I was fortunate to be a co-principal investigator on the Center on Online Learning and Students with Disabilities, which was a collaboration with CAS, an entity out of Boston, the University of Kansas, and NASD, the National Association of State Directors of Special Education. And that work looked nationally at online learning, which prior to the pandemic, as many of us know, thousands of, well, millions of students were involved, tens of thousands of students with disabilities, if not more. And so there's some things we learned. And so part of what I'm going to share with you is pre-pandemic and what we've learned and how we could apply them into this new normal. And so with that in mind, I apologize, folks, I keep clicking my keyboard and I forget I'm supposed to click the arrow. What I wanted to do is I wanted to give some of these big ideas, align them with things that we can do for both educators and also that adult in the home, and overall some tips and strategies to be thinking about to make it practical. Now that schoolvirtually.org at the bottom, similar to what Ace was sharing, out of this pandemic, some colleagues and I put together trying to assist in a very practical application of some of these ideas. So I list that there. Of course, the resource that Ace has shared is an awesome resource. It's much larger than this resource, but this resource is trying to help make things practical in trying to plan for, design for the needs of individuals, particularly with disabilities in this new online. So as we get started, one of the things, of course, we're all there, but I want to just reinforce it, that there's content management systems that many of us are using, that we've had access to use, and we continue to use, come with a lot of nice things to think about for all individuals, particularly individuals with disabilities. But they're not all created equal. And by the way, I just have a smattering up there on our content management systems. And of course, we have our learning management systems as well. And I want to reinforce the fact that, yes, these are tools that we're using as educators and as districts to facilitate instruction. And as we know with our content management, we have elements that align with progress monitoring, elements that give us the type of data through virtual dashboards that could target the needs of our learners. But they're not all equal. They're not all necessarily available. And this is something I want to piggyback on what Ace was sharing. One of the elements we tend to think of with individuals with disabilities is we tend to think of access. And I want to reinforce availability, and I'll reinforce that here as we go along. But as we know, there's a number of different tools that we're using, both from content, learning management, now facilitating more video conferencing, remote learning. I'm still amazed with Zoom going from, 20 million users to 200 million users within, 5 or 6 days. So we're utilizing a lot of these tools, and to me, as I'm working with educators post-pandemic here, is that these aren't new. They've been out there. So how can we use them, and how do we look at them from a variety of different perspectives, and how do we maximize what we've learned in that engagement? And so I'm going to begin actually with that, with thinking about this new normal and realizing, of course, as we all know, this new normal, the classroom is now in the home setting. Duh, Sean, of course, the home setting, as I'm sitting here in my upstairs bedroom, was made for rest and relaxation. And I have 4 school-age children, actually 1 in college, 3 school-age children. And you know, their bedroom was not made for the type of instruction that they're now engaged in. And so that new normal requires some structure, requires some organization, some scheduling, some distractions, things that our students with disabilities often don't have embedded themselves. The executive function components are oftentimes an attribute of their disability, be it a learning disability, an attention, be it emotional, behavioral. That's an element that in and of itself is going to be a bit of a challenge. And so with that in mind, one of the things that is critical, particularly from our work on students with disabilities, is that role of what many online systems have called in the past the learning coach. You know, that adult in the home, the grandparent, the aunt and uncle, the mother and father. And it's so critical because I'm not saying that they are the teacher. I'm not saying that at all. Although some of our data over the years would indicate parents often thought of themselves as a paraeducator or as the tutor or as their child's teacher. But I'm not saying that. What I'm saying here is that role of the parent, the role of the adult in the home has now taken on so much more of a level. And of course, there's a lot of variability and a lot of inequity in respect to what that role is and what we're requiring of that person, from an individual that's teleworking to an individual that's not working to an individual that's working outside the home. But we know for students with disabilities, that is something that we need to empower as educators. That's someone that we need to engage as educators if we're going to be successful, particularly at the elementary, lower middle school levels for students with disabilities. And so they need to be our eyes and ears. They need to be engaged in observation. They could be helpful in so many different things, but they also need to be empowered. And so what does that mean as educators in our role? The educators I'm speaking to over the last several weeks is that, aha, and now how do I go ahead and engage? And I've talked to so many parents that have, you know, parents that are teleworking, parents that are single parents, parents that are single parents unemployed but have children with disabilities that are nonverbal in their homes, how they've looked to the educators to become further empowered, how they've looked to the educators via video conferencing, emails, phone calls, to be that lifeline in this new normal. And so they are very much that learning coach, and how we as educators can empower them to support them, to then empower and support their child. So that's a very new normal aspect. And one of the things I hope is a silver lining, by the way, as we come out of this, hopefully sooner than later, is that continued role of empowering and supporting the parent, because they can be so critical in the education of their children. So with that said, I want to pivot over, though, to what a lot of us think about when we think of online learning, and that's that digital tool, the digital learning materials. And Susan did such a nice job of differentiating the digital versus the online, which is I still struggle with on a daily basis. But to me, when we think of this online, oftentimes we think of these digital materials, and oftentimes we do think of this idea of accessibility. And I want to emphasize here and reinforce in a way what Ace was saying, is that the accessibility is one function. So if you're unfamiliar with the Accessible Education Materials Center, it's a center it's out of group, it's actually out of Boston. But the National Center on Accessible Education Materials offers some phenomenal information from the Department of Ed on what we should be doing for providing accessibility. But oftentimes it's not enough, because oftentimes it focuses on sensory and physical, and not so much on the learning aspect, which to me takes us over to what needs to be available. So for example, when we think about elements like this, we can think of, this is just a screenshot of K-12 Incorporated, a lesson. So is this a digital reading? Is this digital text? Is this content? Is this instruction? What is this? Well, to me, honestly, I don't care what it is, but is it available? And actually, I have a tool inside K-12 that can make it readable, meaning it will read every word, it will highlight each word. It's making it a little bit more accessible. But what about the vocabulary? What about the comprehension? What about the main idea? What about those components? Well, that's another level of availability that we really need to think about for students with disabilities. And so there are tools that make things accessible, and there are some tools that actually make things even more available. So let's take text-to-speech. So text-to-speech, many of us are familiar with. We have it available on any device that we're working with. There are variations of it. So for example, ReadWrite, Text Help is a company. That's sitting on any browser. If I just download via my Google Apps, it will highlight a word, it will highlight a paragraph, it will do a number of different things. I'll get to that in just a moment. But we also have systems like Learning Ally. Learning Ally is, and actually they're, during the pandemic, I think offering most of their tools for free. They offer digital text, but they also offer pre-recorded audio. So I'm getting it not in that tinny voice, but I'm actually getting it in a real person voice that makes it the tone and the connections. Resources like Bookshare have been around for years. Bookshare, if you're unfamiliar with it, this is for any child on an IEP that has a print disability. And there's some really good guidance on what a print disability is. And by the way, my son with Down syndrome has access to this. He has a print disability according to that. And there's hundreds of thousands of resources, excuse me, tens of thousands, I think about 800,000 now. There's a number of different resources available on Bookshare that are digital books, essays, text. I want to read Charlotte's Web. I want to be able to take a look at the works of William Shakespeare. I want access to my textbooks. They're available for people with print disabilities based on their IEP. That digital text is available. Now, this is a screenshot of ReadWrite. And as I mentioned, it's a text help company, so you see the icon of text help. But this offers everything from a reader, as you see up here, with the pause function, where I can highlight the text. It'll read the text, highlight the paragraph. But it also allows me to highlight itself as a highlighter. Oh, wait, what's the main idea? Not highlighting to be read, but regular, I need to go back to this. I need to remember this. Oh, and by the way, what I highlight vocabulary-wise will open up in a Google Doc where it'll not only give me the word, but it'll give me an image and a definition. So this goes much more than simply just access. This is becoming now, the text is becoming more and more available to me in that process. Now, I want to go even a step further. And more systems, Newsela is one of them, Smithsonian, Tweed, Tribune, and others are like this. And as you can see from that screenshot, what I'm doing is, yes, I can get text-to-speech, but now I can change the reading level or the Lexile level of the text. So now it's becoming more available to me in that now, instead of having to have an 8th grade reading level because I'm reading an 8th grade science book, that science book, potentially that science reading, and Newsela would give me different readings, would take me down to potentially a 3rd grade reading level. Yes, I can still use text-to-speech for the accessibility, but now it's more available to my reading level. So these are types of tools and these are types of decisions that we need to be making in connecting to beyond accessibility to the availability of the content for the instructional needs of the students we're working with. Now, how do we go about doing that? Well, that's the beauty and to me the silver lining of online learning. And that is now we're all looking to work for variability, not just students with disabilities. We're all aware of some barriers that exist. We're all aware of the fact that this is a new medium, so what are we going to do? So we're, in a way, looking for a roadmap. We're looking for some guidance. We're looking for a framework. And many of us have seen frameworks like this before. Well, have seen this image. I'll get to a framework. But this image, in terms of this equity versus equality, we have that fence element. But universal design for learning will be the framework I'll emphasize, along with others, but I emphasize this one just because the fact that it takes the barrier of the fence in that third picture away. That fence now, of course, used to be having to be accommodated by the redistribution of boxes. Well, those boxes to me are additional work. They're accommodations, they're modifications. But if we redesign and use digital tools in a different way and think of some of the curriculum that we're now making more available, in so doing, we're going to help a variety of different learners. The silver lining in that now, this online learning, might make things even more available to our individuals with disabilities than when they were in the brick and mortar. For those unfamiliar with the framework, this is not the time or place, I apologize, but it is based on 3 basic principles, and that's multiple means of engaging of the individual, multiple means of representing information for individuals, and multiple means of action expression, allowing individuals to demonstrate what they know. And each of these principles, 3 guiding principles, provide guidelines, checkpoints. It's quite extensive. But with this framework, it allows for us to plan and design in a different manner. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So, of course, we can go back to text-to-speech. So, for example, Snap and Read is a tool that will give you text-to-speech. It'll highlight any digital text-to-speech, makes it accessible. But it also will alter the meaning of words, meaning the words may be at a higher reading level. They'll redefine them right on the go. Oh, and by the way, Snap and Read allows me to grab text and it puts it into an outline, and in the outline I can actually take notes. So now it's taking that text-to-speech accessibility, and because of the design element, it's allowing it to become a note taker, allowing me to focus on the main idea and a host of other things. Now, let's go beyond that though. Video, of course, is our best friend in my opinion. Yes, video can be used and abused, but video has so many different options. See, because video allows me as an instructor to create video to be able to demonstrate what I want you to know, and of course I can get video. But from the learner perspective, I can share and demonstrate what I know through video. I can do a presentation. I can use images with narration with these tools that are increasingly available. As an instructor, I can model to you. So instead of having to Zoom with you or Skype with you, I can model, create that model, place it up in Google Classroom, and you can watch that. And by the way, your learning coach can watch it with you to understand what we're trying to do instructionally here. And so there's a host of other things we can do with video, both as the instructor side, but also as the student side. Now, we can also, of course, across technologies, when we think of design aspects, with these digital tools, allow for a number of different things to take place. So, for example, if I want to help with that reader, I can create my own books that are potentially lower in terms of reading level, and integrating more images. I can allow for a variety of different ways for students to present what they know, everything from apps like Explain Everything, which is a collaborative whiteboard, to VoiceThread, which allows me that video, audio, and that interaction. I can create infographics with Canva and Adobe Spark to share what I know. I can create cartoons to demonstrate what I know. A lot of this goes back and forth, what the teacher can do and what the student can do. Again, writing supports, they're built in, storyboards that allow me to align what I want to share. There's a host of digital tools that allow me, from a UDL perspective here, from expression, allow a variety of different tools. Now, I'm running out of my time. I do want to make you aware again, including what is shared, was an awesome resource. School Virtually offers a number of different ideas to be able to facilitate this new normal. And I hope I've touched upon a few ideas to get you thinking. And with that, I will share it back to Ashley, who will take on the facilitation of questions.
Hi, Susan here. Thank you, Sean. That was fantastic. I have been monitoring the chat room, and we encourage people to type in questions. The first question I have here is from Cindy Gallagher, and she's asking, are you aware of the UDL Innovators Group coming out of Katie Novak and George Koros? I found them on learningrevolution.com.
So, Ace, I think I'll take that. There's a number of folks doing some awesome work when it comes to the application of universal design for learning. And so I'm familiar with that work as well as there's a number of others. So if that helps, I mean, there's CAST, of course, CAST are the founders of this idea, and from that, a number of different resources have created to not only understand what UDL is, but also the application.
Yeah, I think that's a shot. There's a lot of great resources, and I think there's a good coalition of organizations, which I think Katie is a part of as well.
Terrific. We're waiting for other questions to come in from the attendees. Sean, I didn't know if you wanted to go back. You have so many great resources, and spend a little more time on one of the slides that you had to speed through. We've gotten a number of questions just asking if the PowerPoints and the webinar will be archived, and they will be archived and available. There'll be a follow-up email after the webinar sent to folks.
Sure, and cut me off when I'm going too far, but a couple of ideas here, folks. Think of video, and think of the IEP, and think of the progress monitoring element we need to do. So I'm supposed to record the fluency and articulation of individuals with speech. And actually, the language isn't record. I'm supposed to observe. I'm supposed to collect data on that. Why wouldn't we have an individual simply talking to GarageBand or talking to a variety of free tools, Audacity, things of that nature, record it? And of course, I as a teacher, as a speech and language pathologist, could give what I am asking you to record. I may need the learning coach's assistance to facilitate this, but if I'm using tools that are built into the LMS, or the CMS, the recording option's already there, and the child then records. So now I'm collecting that data in a very purposeful manner. By the way, I could have them reading passages for their fluency reading, let alone speech and language concerns. I could have them videoing their ability to make connections in some of their writing tasks, where it's not so much the product, it's the process that we normally observe. So video in and of itself could be very much aligned with the progress monitoring we need to do for the IEP. I'll stop there, Susan. I don't want to take away from other questions. Great.
No, that's super helpful. There's a really interesting question here from Sarah Lynch, kind of pointing back to the conversation in your presentation around the role of parents or the role of learning coaches and thinking about the relationship with instructors, teachers, support staff. So she asks, the role of the parent/caregiver significantly shifts in distance learning, especially for students with disabilities, and their role as a member of the IEP team is shifting. Families I'm connected with are reporting that their insights and feedback are being heard and responded to in ways that they haven't experienced before. And the newness of distance learning flattens a traditional power hierarchy of expertise among the team. I'm curious how we learn from this shift in relationship and carry it forward into the post-COVID world. How are field leaders and researchers leaning into and documenting the student/family experience right now? Any insights into that?
I mean, I can start that off, and I think Sean can give more deep insight on this, because I think that's one of the things that they researched at the Center for Online Learning of Students with Disabilities. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of different roles that a lot of us get used to. So, like, for example, just, you know, as a parent this morning, trying to have a conference call with my 4-year-old, you know, just asking for my attention. I think that one thing that I've noticed a lot is that families have a deeper appreciation of the incredible skill that our educators have in doing their work. I know I've gotten a new appreciation even being in education policy over the course of the last several weeks. So I think that we have to, one, from educator standpoint, recognize all these new demands that are being placed on parents. Like, parents are going to be the nurses, parents are going to be the case managers, parents are going to be the teaching aid. And, you know, education and being an educator is a specific skill. It's a craft, and often it's too much to put that. I mean, even not just even under this context, but under any context, it's too much for to place on one parent. So to the extent that we can kind of like delineate communication channels to be able to do this well, to communicate with families what the expectations are on them, how they can connect with our educators. I think what it will come down to, hopefully the lesson from this and the past, is that we need to be intentional. Those things that were mentioned are definitely a potential, like we can create more seamless communication with our families, but that is not an inevitable outcome. That only happens based on a level of intentionality that we build systems in to do that. So I think that there are families that aren't experiencing that. They might be experiencing quite the opposite. And in either case, I think it's a question of intentionality. How do we build this in from the beginning, make sure that we have systems and protocols for how students communicate with their teachers, how parents communicate with their teachers, all groups knowing what the expectations are on them, and then we have systems to be able to course correct if things aren't going as well.
I just want to piggyback on that, ditto a lot to what Ace is sharing. You know, the initial special education legislation passed in 1975 mentioned parents, I think, over 100 times. And you know, I'm really hopeful the silver lining in one of these outcomes here is that the parent, you know, the parent is of course, we're the teacher of our children. But you know, I prepare future educators. We have standards, we have endorsements, there's expertise that our educators are bringing to the table. I'm not about to discount that level of expertise, but my hope is that that level of parent engagement. I was blessed with a son with Down syndrome 19 years ago, and I can tell you I've learned a tremendous amount about being a parent of a child with a disability. My role at home, my job to help support what the educators are trying to do in a very limited period of time in a normal school day. I've taken that responsibility on, and I've joked over the years, my job, you know, the University of Kansas pays me full-time, but I have an awesome part-time job. You know, the pay stinks. There's no pay, but the benefits is I'm working with my son and trying to, you know, develop his skills. I think and I hope that this connection with parents are understanding, getting empowered, and getting reinforced to do will continue when our children go back to school, where in the evenings, on the weekends, we'll be able to do some of these things that potentially maybe in the past we've said, well, that's what educators do, or that's what happens in the school. And clearly, as a parent of a child with disability, I've heard and seen that a number of times. And so I'm hoping that that is one of our positive shifts as an outcome. So.
Great, thank you. We've got several questions coming in, some real nuts and bolts, and we just encourage those participating in the webinar too for the questions around some tools and curriculum. If you're using some and want to share those, feel free to engage with each other in the chat. I've got a question from Jamie. What's a suggestion for closed captioning when classrooms are using live video conferencing options? Any suggestions people want to share or type in, or Sean or Ace, do you recommend any? See, someone is suggesting Seesaw and Flipgrid.
Right. And we've been using Zoom for that capacity in terms of, and it also will transcribe your entire conversation as well. So that if you have access to that, that's what we've been using. I'm not an expert on the others, but that clearly has been helpful for us.
Great. Janet Caramello has a question too, if you slide up to that, which is, for a child with DS and their learning profile, visual learner, struggle with auditory, etc., what is a website where we can get other specific curriculum websites or apps, including for social studies and science? Ace, do you want to take a stab at that?
Can you hear me?
Or Sean?
Okay. I think that I would defer to Sean on that in terms of, I know he's not only researched that, but also lived it. The one plug I'll have for that is it's something that we've been trying to just like hone in and gather all these different questions on Educating All Learners Alliance. So we're working on, like, we have a Down syndrome organization as part of the broader alliance, and we're trying to curate resources exactly on those kinds of topics. But I know Sean will probably have exact resources.
Well, I wish I did. You know, one of the things that we need to be aware of, and what I was reinforcing at the beginning, is a number of the content and learning management systems, they're phenomenally designed, but they weren't necessarily designed for individuals with disabilities in mind. Maybe for accessibility, but maybe not some of that availability. So I'm not familiar with the content or learning management system out there for students designed for intellectual disabilities. Now, with that said, there's some really good resources that can potentially be combined. News to You is one. News, and then the number 2, and then You, as in Y-O-U. They've created some really good materials for reading and also increasingly for math. And there's a number of other targeted companies out there that have created some resources. The Attainment Company. News to You has done more digital, so they're more ready to be used online. And so my emphasis to an individual that raised that question would be looking to, okay, let's focus in on that challenge, and of course then look to some of the digital tools that you're being made available to how to be able to use those tools. And for example, my son Nolan utilized a lot of tools that you would never think were designed for individuals with Down syndrome, but we began with, what are we trying to do with Nolan? Like, for example, the recording for speech. We just wanted more speech availability, so we started immediately using GarageBand, and then he wanted to get into the video. So that example I offered earlier comes right out of my house years ago. And those tools weren't designed for Nolan that way. It was rather, what's the need that we're trying to address, and then let's go ahead and try and find some tools. Tar Heel Reader is another one, Tar Heel Reader, that offers some really leveled books for individuals with intellectual disabilities. I'll stop, but there's just a few.
Great, thank you. Cindy asked another question. How do you see the time commitment for students traditional school requires versus remote learning? Now that's a tough one, given the fluidity of schedules in this shift to remote learning.
Can I jump in on that one first, Ace?
Yeah, sure, absolutely, Sean.
And I would have to say, folks, I learned this very early on as a researcher, but also the awesome presentations done at the ORT Institute. And that was, we really need to think about time differently when online. Everything from, it may not be so much that we need a certain amount of time. Now, of course, we need to, when we design and plan, we need to design and plan for how long it will take. And we need to be thinking about the variety of learners when we do that. And that goes back to hopefully some of the considerations with universal design for learning. But where I was going for time in that, oh gosh, are they in their seats? Do they check in, et cetera? So much of, I think, online learning could be seen as, wait, we have these interests that we have these big ideas we're trying to accomplish. We have these lessons that we've organized for these big ideas. And now we're going to give you flexibility to when is appropriate, when that learning coach is available, when you're able to focus in on it, so that maybe we'll target out, okay, complete so much by Friday and it's Monday. And then by Tuesday, we'll give you these types of supports. Wednesday, we'll do a check-in to reinforce where you are. Thursday, we'll do some additional reinforcement, support, direct instruction. And then by Friday, you've completed those elements. Now, did you do them all on Wednesday? We don't know. When did you focus in on them? That gives that flexibility for not only what's happening in the home, but also what's happening with the learner themselves. That, to me, is a whole other kind of looking at time and how we looked at time, measure time, things of that nature. I'm not sure if that's exactly where the person was going with that question, but I think that's a key element in flexibility with online distance learning.
And the only thing I think I would add to that is just starting with the needs of that student. I think back to the previous question. That student gets a certain level of services to be able to succeed in their educational experience in school. And I think it's to take a step back and see what those needs are that brought about those services, and then how those needs get met in a virtual context. And there's trade-offs in that. I think the biggest trade-off that I can think of is how do you make sure that that student gets the personal attention that they need, and the tiered systems of support, like the more intensive supports, to be able to succeed. The one thing I think I would harken back to is we are in such a rush, I feel, to make sure that our students understand content, that we may be getting ahead of the fact of what they emotionally need at this point. I think that as adults, I know as a parent, this happened, and all I could think about is how to bring about normalcy for my child. A lot of us are thinking about that on level. So the greatest thing, normalcy, is how do we control it, is how do we deliver that same sort of experience that they would have had? How do we make sure that it's seamless? And that's great to a certain extent, but I think that we can't lose sight of the fact that our students are emotionally and personally processing this, depending on their age, and frankly, the disability can interact with that and those issues, whether you have executive functioning issues or emotional behavioral disorders or learning disabilities. All those things can bring about other sorts of issues that we need to be more attentive to. So for me, I think the challenge is to start by thinking about the normalcy, like what is it that the services, what was the disability, what are the needs that now they bring about in online environments, and yeah, we can be more flexible in how we deliver it, but make sure that we don't lose sight of those specific needs. But then also to think about the emerging needs that students have based on the context right now, and how are we up to those kinds of additional challenges that are coming about.
Thanks, Ace. That's a really important point. Just what the learning sciences tell us about how important students' well-being, their social emotional well-being is for the entire learning process, and that is certainly no different now during this time of remote learning, but even more important, there are so many complex challenges and unknowns happening with stay-at-home orders and the school closures. It's just a really important point worth emphasizing. I've got a question from Sarah Watson that is focused on parents. What kinds of trainings are there for parents to get them to be able to utilize these materials and tools?
That's a good question. So this is Sean again. Ace, I'll try to make it brief. I do know online schools have provided there are some resources via online schools For example, actually, K-12 Incorporated Connections Academy do have some resources on roles of learning coaches and things that they need to know the background. I do know that they've created, and online schools have created, structures for bringing a parent on and bringing a student on. Oftentimes those trainings focus in on the how-to elements of the programs, making sure that they're comfortable with the navigation, maybe making sure they're comfortable with the content or learning management system. They oftentimes have not, in my experience, focused in on how we further communicate. Well, communication's been an element of it. I take that back. So how to use the tools for communication, the process of communication. So that would be an element I would add as well. An element that I think we need to add that oftentimes is missed is that level of empowerment. And what I've seen where it works in training, and that has been more kind of individual, I haven't seen it at the macro level, I've seen it at the micro level, and that is where teachers have taken on the role to say, I'm going to be very purposeful this week in empowering these groups of learning coaches, these groups of parents with a group of individuals they're really trying to meet, and do it I'm going to do this phone call in this manner. I'm going to send out these notes in this manner. I'm going to do a video conference for a small group of parents in this manner. So that level of empowerment is very strategic, it's very purposeful, and it may not be systematic for all individuals. That's where I've seen kind of not necessarily at the macro level, again at the micro level, but it's been very, very effective for teachers that have done that. But again, as a reinforcement, there are some general ideas for learning coaches through current content management systems like K-12 Incorporated Connections Academy. So I would be checking if your school district had any virtual learning prior to this, maybe checking with them for some of those resources they've already created.
And I would just add to that, I think that largely this is going to be a responsibility of your schools and your educators, because there's going to be so many different tech tools, and they're going to be different across your schools. I think that what often happens is that there's a very general feedback and general information that's provided to parents, and that may not be useful or sufficient, we should say, for parents of students with disabilities. So I think that this is really a responsibility of the school district and your child's school to be able to identify, these are the tech platforms that we're using, these are the individuals that you will interact with in terms of serving your child, these are the roles that they will serve. This is when you can access them. I think that what's happened that we've heard about recently is that just parents are going to and asking the same question of 5 different individuals, and then you're getting different answers. So I think the more that the school can set up a coordinated plan around who the parent goes to around different areas and clarify what those expectations are and clarify the vulnerabilities. I mean, we don't have this figured out. There's no reason why we would have had this figured out. Like schools and districts are institutions. Institutions are made of human beings, and this is one that's had to turn on a dime. And so I think that the more open line of communication that we have between families, schools, and educators, the better. And I think that the only thing that I would charge with schools and districts is to be very specific about the needs of some of these learners, be they English learners or students with disabilities, that their families and the communities will need a different sort of communication. And to be ready to provide that.
Well, thank you both so much. I just want to give another shout out to both of you and all of the work that you've done. We've tried to embed links pointing back to your websites and the resources that you've made available to the field. I'll give a shout out for our team at ORT Institute in putting this webinar together and the COVID resources on our website. It's a really important point. We've seen that some of the districts and schools that did have continuity of learning plans in place had conducted readiness assessments that involved parents and students as well as teacher training for moving into online learning. Some schools and districts do hold e-learning days where they ensure that they have access to the tools. Those are some of the more prepared districts over the years. I'd like to thank all of our participants today for engaging in what was a lively chat. and share your resources that you're using. Please know that this webinar and the PowerPoint all will be available. The webinar was recorded and will be on the aurorainstitute.org website. Please join me in thanking our presenters for their time today and their expertise. And please don't hesitate to reach out if we can be of service. We have 2 upcoming webinars, one on May 5th, where we're bringing in online teachers with more than 2 decades of experience in online teaching and advice for new teachers that are just getting started with online teaching and learning. And then on May 12th, we have an annual webinar that's an introduction to K-12 competency-based education. We hope to see you there. Thank you, and thanks for joining us today. Bye-bye.